You know, it always kind of blows my mind how many of the biggest names in science, like the folks who literally mapped out the universe, also have this, well, kind of mystical side.
Yeah, it is kind of striking.
Like Newton, you know that quote about only gathering shells on the shore of a vast ocean?
Right.
Where it's like
Well,
even he felt this huge, like, unknowable mystery out there.
right at the edge of everything he could prove. Yeah.
Exactly. And it really makes you think how intertwined are science and, like, the mystical, the spiritual.
It's a fascinating tension, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
On one hand, you've got that drive to measure,
Mm.
to dissect the universe through logic. And then on the other, there's this persistent feeling,
Mm.
this intuition, like there's more.
More than we can measure.
Exactly, like a whole layer of reality that just slips through the scientific net. And almost like the more they discovered, the more they bumped up against that mystery.
Oh, totally. And it's not just like a one-off thing either. Think about spectral analysis.
Oh, good example.
Auguste Comte, Mr. Positivism himself, he declared studying the composition of stars completely unknowable.
Ignorabimus. He said, yeah, we will not know. Famous last words, basically.
Famous last words exactly. Because then, boom, spectral analysis shows up.
And suddenly this whole new world of knowledge opens up.
Exactly. Talk about limits to scientific certainty.
It's a good lesson in humility, for sure, for anyone pursuing knowledge. Which brings us to, well, the subject of our deep dive today.
Yes, pages 136 to 159 from Hozirif. And these pages really get into that interplay between consciousness and a larger reality.
They really do.
They touch on ancient mysticism, modern philosophy, you name it. It's a lot to unpack.
A lot to unpack, for sure.
So our mission today is to kind of extract the core ideas here. How is human consciousness described? How does it connect to the physical world and maybe even to something beyond the physical?
Precisely. And how does it evolve?
Yeah.
And what does this all mean for us, in terms of self-knowledge and our place in the cosmos?
Okay, so maybe a good starting point is that historical dance between science and mysticism that we were talking about.
Sure. Good place to start.
Like the text points out Newton, Pascal, Kepler, Descartes, all these giants of science, but it also mentions their mystical leanings.
Mm.
It's almost like their scientific breakthroughs didn't somehow negate their sense of wonder, like a belief in something transcendent.
It's a very different intellectual climate, of course, than what we have today.
Oh, yeah.
But I think what's so fascinating is it challenges those rigid categories we create,
Hmm.
rational versus spiritual.
Totally.
These folks, they saw scientific inquiry as a way to understand God's creation, to glimpse the divine order in things.
Right. So science and faith weren't seen as these mutually exclusive things.
Exactly.
Then there's this contrast that the text makes between what it calls Europe's idealism of reason.
Regel's phrase, yeah. The little Promethean spark.
Right. Versus, get this, the abundant light and power of Eastern idealism. It even calls it a divine radiance.
Wow. Quite the contrast.
Yeah, right. And there's even a quote about Vedanta philosophy holding a uniquely high place among philosophical systems because of how it links the individual self to the essence of divinity.
It really highlights these different approaches to humanity's place in the universe.
Totally different perspectives.
European rationalism was focused on observation, on reason, building knowledge from the ground up.
From the ground up, yeah.
Whereas Eastern idealism, like in Vedanta, emphasized this inherent interconnectedness, the idea that the individual soul is, ultimately unified with this divine source.
And then weaving through all this, there's that Spinoza quote, all ideas are true insofar as they are linked to God.
Ooh, that sets a pretty interesting tone for thinking about, well, being and consciousness, doesn't it?
All right.
It kind of blurs the lines between our individual minds and, like, a higher intellect, suggesting there's a deeper truth underlying our thoughts.
So with that as our backdrop, how do these pages from Lenas describe being and consciousness?
Okay, so let's see. We've got being in prolongation as this supreme transcendental reality.
Yeah, this kind of primary substance.
Right. And then it's divided into, transcendental essence and transcendental consciousness.
Right, transcendental essence, which is linked to the idea of divinity. And then transcendental consciousness, which is described as the inner nature of being.
Okay, yeah.
So help me unpack this. What's the, crucial takeaway here for folks?
I think the key idea is that there's this fundamental reality, right? This, ground of existence that's both the source of everything and the fabric of everything. It's both.
Okay.
So the transcendental essence is kind of like, you could think of it as the blueprint, the potential for everything that exists.
Potential.
And then the transcendental consciousness is the awareness,
Yeah.
the active knowing part of that being. And the thing is, they're not separate.
Two sides of the same coin, kind of.
Exactly. Two inseparable aspects of this supreme reality. It's not like consciousness is added to being.
It's just part of what being is.
Right. It's fundamental.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. And then the text contrasts this absolute world with our world, the world of differentiated being, what we experience every day. And it describes our reality as this field of varying consciousness intensity.
Right.
So is the idea here that our everyday experience is like a less concentrated form of this cosmic consciousness?
Exactly. It's like, imagine a light source,
Yeah.
right? Really intensely bright.
Okay.
Now, as the light spreads out, it gets less intense, right? Dimmer.
Sure.
But it's still the same light. It's just less concentrated.
I get it.
So the absolute world is kind of like that pure, undiluted light of consciousness. And our world, with all these individual beings, is like that same light spread out with varying degrees of intensity, which is why things seem so different, even though they're ultimately like emanations of that same source.
Right, right. And then, where do we fit into this picture? Because the text positions Homo sapiens, that's us, by the way, in case anyone forgot, as like a focal point of this cosmic consciousness, a point where both these, what they call them, hypostases of being come together.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not just passive observers in this. We're somehow central to this whole cosmic awareness thing.
Exactly. It's saying humanity isn't just some random occurrence. We're this point where both the fundamental nature of being and the conscious awareness of that being are like most fully expressed.
So we're like, I don't know, microcosms of the macrocosm.
Exactly.
Which leads into this whole idea of illusion, because the text says that from the perspective of the supreme synthesis, the createdness of reality is illusory.
Interesting.
But to our separated consciousness, it seems completely real. So how can both be true?
It's one of those things that comes up a lot in mystical traditions and philosophy, actually.
Yeah.
And it's not saying that our experiences aren't real, in the sense that they're not happening.
No.
It's more about the boundaries we perceive, the boundaries between ourselves and the rest of reality. Those are ultimately kind of artificial. From the perspective of the absolute, there is no separation. Everything's interconnected. It's all part of the same, underlying being.
But our limited perspective makes it seem like things are separate.
Exactly. It's that sense of separation that creates the illusion of a truly independent, created reality.
And that connects to the idea of the suprapersonality that's mentioned. It's described as this totality of individual differentiations, the first category of absolute reality. So all these separate selves, all our individual experiences, they all add up to something bigger, something more unified.
Exactly. It's like, imagine all the individual drops of water in the ocean.
Right. Okay.
Each one's distinct, but they're all part of the same ocean.
Right.
So the superpersonality is kind of like that. It's the sum total of all these individual expressions of consciousness. It encompasses them all, but it isn't limited to any single one.
So it's the unity within the diversity.
Precisely.
And the text makes this point that even though the absolute, that, ultimate source of everything is ultimately inaccessible to us, we can still kind of sense how far removed something is from its absolute prototype. It's almost like even if we can't see the destination, we have this internal compass.
That's a beautiful way to put it, actually. I think it speaks to this really deep human capacity we have for discernment, for sensing the underlying truth, even if we can't fully grasp it intellectually.
Yeah. We may not be able to define the absolute, but we can sort of feel our way towards it.
Exactly.
And this brings us to intuition, right? Because the text quotes Schopenhauer and Bergson, emphasizing intuition as this primary way of perceiving reality. They even call it prima inter pares.
Just among equals, yeah.
And it emphasizes how subjective intuition is. So how is that different from, our rational minds, from reason?
It's a good question. I think what's interesting about intuition is that it bypasses that whole analytical step-by-step process that we use with reason.
Okay.
Intuition is more like this direct apprehension of truth, like a knowing that comes from somewhere deeper.
A gut feeling, kind of.
Well, it's more than just a feeling, I think. Like Schopenhauer, he saw philosophy as this conscious return to intuitive insights. And Bergson, he considered intuition to be like a primary mode of perception, not just a way, but the main way of accessing reality.
So not just fuzzy feelings.
Exactly. And the subjective part is key. Because intuition is personal. It comes from within.
Right. And this connects to how Kabbalah is described. The text says that in Kabbalah, Kabbalah itself is understood as the intuitive perception of truth.
By the rational soul, yeah. It calls it a divine science.
So it's not anti-reason, it's like reason, but elevated.
Exactly. Kabbalah, in this context, it's not opposed to reason. It's like reason that's been attuned to these deeper intuitive currents.
Like the intellect, but illuminated.
Exactly.
And then the text introduces this idea of the cosmic passive environment. It calls it the, quote, phenomenal picture of the world. And there's this formula. Man lives in a world of realized impulses, but through the sense of synthesis, achieves a priori knowledge of polarly opposite beginnings. So help me synthesize that.
Okay, so picture the cosmic passive environment as the stage, right? The stage where our reality unfolds. The canvas, if you will. And on that canvas, you've got all these realized impulses, like the events that happen, the energies that manifest in our world, and our sense of synthesis.
Yeah.
That's our ability to integrate our experiences,
Oh,
to see the connections, the bigger picture.
Okay.
And through that synthesis, we can actually gain knowledge that precedes direct experience. They call it a priori knowledge.
Okay.
And this knowledge is about the fundamental polarities of existence. You know, like the opposing forces, the principles that underlie everything.
Can you give me an example?
Here, think of hot and cold.
Okay.
Those are like realized impulses. You experience them directly. But your mind can also grasp the concept of temperature.
Right, as this underlying thing.
Exactly. And that's a priori knowledge of the opposites. You don't need to constantly be experiencing hot and cold to understand the idea of temperature.
That's a great example, thank you. Okay, so then we get to this supreme synthetic teaching, also known as the sacred book of Thoth. And it's described as this, well, system of doctrines, basically. And these doctrines outline the different stages of how the single reality, like that ultimate source we were talking about, affirms itself. And the text says it also outlines the paths for the human creative spirit to, like, regain this lost unity. So it's like a blueprint for spiritual evolution.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. The Sacred Book of Thoth, as it's presented here, it's not just a collection of stories or symbols. It's like this map. It lays out the journey of consciousness.
Okay.
From its origin in the one reality to that fragmented state we experience in our world and then back again to unity.
The return journey.
Exactly.
And the text mentions it's got 3 parts, but we're mostly focused on the first 2, the ones that contain the 21 great arcana.
Right.
And there's this interesting thing about the numbering of those arcana.
Yeah.
Like the 21st one is numbered either XXY or 0, and then the 22nd one is either XXY or X2. What's the deal with that? What's the significance?
That's a good question. I think that dual numbering is hinting at something about, like, the cyclical nature of these teachings, you know, and how everything's interconnected.
Okay.
Like, the number 0 often represents potential, right? The unmanifest. So the fact that the 21st Arcanum is also numbered 0, it kind of suggests a return to the source.
Like a completion.
Right, completion of a cycle. And then the interplay between 21 and 22, it's like this back and forth, a transition, a movement between different levels of reality within the system.
It's like numbers representing a cycle that never ends.
Exactly.
Okay. And then shifting gears a bit, the text touches on ancient wisdom traditions, things like Egyptian teachings, Kabbalah, and of course, Gnosticism. And we get this like brief mention of Simon Magus.
Yeah.
And the text points out how hard it is to really understand his teachings, you know, because so many of the primary sources are lost.
And the ones we do have are often biased.
Right, written by folks who weren't exactly fans of Gnosticism.
Exactly.
So it's almost like this historical puzzle trying to piece together these ancient ideas.
It is. Especially with early Christianity, there were so many different schools of thought, so many movements, and Gnosticism was this huge one. But for centuries, what we knew about it was basically filtered through, like, church apologists.
Folks who wanted to discredit it.
Exactly.
So it's taken a long time to get a clearer picture.
Absolutely.
But then the text highlights this discovery of the Philosophomena by Hippolytus. It was found in the 19th century, and it's been really important for understanding Gnosticism.
Right, because Hippolytus, even though he was writing from a critical perspective, he actually included tons of quotes from Gnostic texts, and he went into a lot of detail about their beliefs.
So even though he was against it, he gave us a more direct look at what they actually believed.
Exactly,
Yeah.
which meant that scholars could finally start to reconstruct those teachings with, like, a lot more accuracy.
It's like getting this whole missing piece of the puzzle.
Totally. And it shows a much more sophisticated, much more nuanced picture of Gnosticism than what people had thought before.
And then the text goes on to connect these Gnostic teachings with a bunch of other traditions, like what we were talking about.
Right. The Egyptian stuff, Kabbalah, Hellenic philosophy.
Exactly. And it connects them all to Neoplatonism as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the point it makes is that there's this pure transmission of the doctrine of being happening across all these different traditions.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like, they're all pointing towards the same underlying understanding of reality, even though they use different words and symbols.
Exactly. There are all these parallels when you look at the core ideas about being, consciousness, the divine, like a common thread running through it all.
A shared wisdom.
Right.
And we even get a quote from Simon Magus himself saying that God is, quote, the totality and first source of the potencies of being.
Oh, wow.
Which really echoes those earlier ideas we were talking about, about the supreme transcendental reality.
It does. It really emphasizes that everything comes from a single source, like this wellspring of all being and all potential.
Then the text brings in St. Martin, and he talks about God's eternal, unchanging nature and how our existence is like something borrowed from that source.
Mm-hmm.
It really puts our individual lives in perspective,
It really does. You realize how temporary we are compared to that absolute, unchanging nature of the divine.
Right. It's like this reminder that our being ultimately comes from something bigger than ourselves.
And true understanding involves recognizing that, remembering our source.
Okay, so then we get into this idea that world creation itself is an aspect of God's self-consciousness.
Oh, interesting.
The text calls it this God creating. And the way this process is described, there are three parts: emanation, manifestation, and reflection.
Okay, break that down for me.
So emanation, I think of that as like a flowing forth from the source.
Like a wellspring, overflowing.
Exactly. Then you have manifestation, which is that flowing forth, becoming something tangible, appearing in the relative world.
Okay.
And then reflection. That's like this mirroring or representation of the divine within the created world.
So it's this whole dynamic process.
Right, of how the unmanifest becomes manifest.
Exactly.
And this ties directly into what the text calls the doctrine of Arcanum the First, which says the creating divinity connects the absolute with the manifested world.
Oh, I see.
So this first major principle in the sacred book of Thoth seems to be all about that fundamental link between the transcendent source and our everyday reality.
And the creating divinity is that bridge.
Exactly.
It's like the link that allows us to understand how the universe works, how that absolute expresses itself in the world.
Right. And then we move into this concept of the divine trinity.
Or the ternary law.
Right. And the text gives all these examples. You've got Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva from Hinduism, the three parks from Norse mythology, the three Norns, also Norse, and so on.
It's fascinating how often this threefold principle shows up.
Right. In all these different religions, different cultures, like this recurring theme.
Totally. I think it represents this fundamental triplicity.
A threeness.
Yeah. And it often symbolizes the interplay of forces, within the divine itself or within the cosmos, like creation, preservation, and destruction.
Right. Or being, knowing, and acting.
Exactly.
And the text says that this first divine turner, this threefold principle, is actually the foundation of all religions.
Oh.
It exists as a whole, but it manifests in all these different forms.
It's like beneath all the variations in doctrines and mythology, you have this underlying structure, this unifying principle.
So those different trinities, they're just different ways of expressing the same fundamental truth.
That's the idea, yeah.
And then, speaking of expression, the text talks about our individual consciousness, our sense of self, as this manifestation of the undivided whole. Like it originates in this divine consciousness, but it takes on this individual existence. So our I, that sense of me, it's not truly separate.
It's a facet of something larger.
Exactly. Like we're these individual waves on the ocean, Each wave is distinct, but they're all part of the same water.
That's a great analogy.
And the text calls this primary divine creativity, like the divine creating these individual centums of awareness, monads it calls them, and they're described as these quasi-independent substances.
Quasi-independent.
So they have their own, distinct existence, but they're still ultimately part of that source.
Right. It's like trying to describe how this one reality can differentiate itself, become all these individual beings that we see.
Right.
And those monads, they're like the building blocks of the universe. each one with its own perspective.
And the text goes on to say that this process of reality affirming itself, it actually continues through those individual monads.
Interesting.
So it's like each of us, as we affirm our own existence, our own self, we're also affirming the divine whole.
That's a pretty powerful idea.
It is. Like our little journeys of self-discovery, they actually have this cosmic significance.
Each one contributing to the unfolding of reality.
And then we get Spinoza again. This time it's that quote, in Latin no less. De intellectum, resque ab ipso intellectus, unum et idem esse. Which basically means God's intellect and the things it understands are one and the same.
That's intense.
It is. It's like there is no separation between the creator and the creation, at least not in the way that we usually think about it.
It makes you think differently about God, not as some distant being, but as this presence that's woven into the fabric of everything.
And the text connects that to this Kabbalistic idea about the first three Sephirot.
Oh, right.
You've got the crown, wisdom, and reason. And in Kabbalah, they're understood as one.
So the creator is the knowledge, the knower, and the known all at once.
Exactly. And that's so different from how we experience knowledge.
Right. For us, there's a subject, like the person who's learning.
No.
Right. And then there's the object, what's being learned. And the act of knowing, that's a separate thing. But for the divine, it's all one. God just is knowledge. And everything that exists is within that knowing.
So it's a completely different level of awareness.
It's a state of perfect self-awareness.
And then, speaking of how we see things, the text talks about the relative nature of binaries.
Binary.
Those pairs of opposites, like good and evil, light and dark, male and female.
Right.
And it uses the example of Ptolemy and Copernicus and modern astronomy.
Okay, how so?
Well, remember, Ptolemy thought the Earth was the center of the universe, and then Copernicus came along and said, no, it's the sun.
Right.
And now we know that even the sun isn't the center of everything.
It was just this little solar system in a vast galaxy.
Exactly. So the point the text is making is that the principle of the binary, the idea of opposites, that's absolute. It's always there.
Okay.
But which one we see as the center, that's relative.
To our perspective.
To our understanding.
I see. It's like the framework is constant, but the details change depending on where you're standing.
Exactly. And it connects this whole binary thing to the world of reason. How our minds work.
In what way?
Well, reason is all about making distinctions, right?
Yeah.
Categorizing things, saying this is this and that is that. And that's how we engage with these binaries, through affirmation and negation.
Like yes and no, this or that.
Exactly.
So reason is all about duality.
It's the tool we use to navigate that world of opposites.
That makes sense.
Then we get into the section called The Beginnings of the Doctrine of the Private Turner. And it says that a private binary, meaning like a specific instance of a binary, is inherently unstable.
Unstable, how so?
Because of that attraction between the opposites.
Oh, right. Like those opposing forces, they naturally want to interact to resolve themselves somehow.
Exactly. And the text says that every phenomenon, every perception arises from the interaction of what it calls vipers.
Vipers. Okay, now we're getting into some esoteric terminology.
Okay.
What's a viper?
I think it's like each specific instance of a binary coming together, the two sides of a binary interacting.
So like every event, everything we perceive, it implies that some kind of underlying duality is at play.
Right. And then we get St. Martin again, and he says that the thesis, like the positive side of a binary, exists independently. But the antithesis, the negative, only exists in relation to that. It's like a shadow.
So it's not a symmetrical relationship.
Right. It's like light exists on its own, but darkness is just the absence of light.
Interesting.
And then the text goes on to talk about the neutralization of binaries.
Neutralization.
Yeah, like resolving those opposites. And it says that's how we rediscover essence, the archetype behind the binary.
So it's not about destroying one side of the binary, but about transcending that opposition.
Exactly. Going beyond the conflict to find the common source.
To see the unity behind the duality.
Right. And then there's this big moment that's described. It happens at the limit of primary world creation. The text calls it the act of the birth of the Logos. And it's where the divine consciousness, which was this whole undifferentiated thing, transforms into the source of procreation.
This is like this pivotal point in the whole cosmic unfolding.
Yeah, like a transition. The divine consciousness reaches the limit of its initial creative impulse, and it becomes this wellspring of everything that comes after.
So it goes from being this undifferentiated unity to being this source of infinite diversity.
And then it gets even more wild, because the text describes how that divine consciousness actually fragments.
Fragments.
Yeah, like it breaks up into all these individual realities, the monads we talked about. And this happens during the first differentially small stage of emanation.
So it's like the one becomes the many.
Right. And the text identifies this with Arcanum the Fourth, the birth of the cosmic logos.
Oh, I see.
So this fourth principle is all about the manifest world coming into being, like as this expression of the divine self-awareness.
So first you have the potential for creation in those first three arcana. And then in the fourth, that potential is realized.
Exactly. It's like, bam, the universe is born.
And then the text gets into this discussion about the substantiality of manifestation.
Okay.
It says that the very fact that the manifested world exists, that it has substance, is a direct consequence of the divine essence itself.
So the material world is like this reflection of the divine reality.
Precisely. And the text says that this substantiality is expressed in the vitality of the manifested world.
Like the life force we see everywhere.
Exactly.
And there's that quote from Leibniz, where there is self-manifestation, there is life or vitality.
It emphasizes that self-expression is fundamental to being alive. You know, the more something manifests its true nature, the more vibrantly it exists.
And that applies to everything, not just individuals, but the whole cosmos.
The whole shebang.
Then the text describes this primary substance. Remember, that's like the ultimate ground of being we were talking about. And it says that this primary substance exists and lives independently of its manifestations.
So it's beyond even the act of creation.
Right. It's like the source isn't dependent on what it creates. It exists in its own right.
And then the text connects that to this Hindu idea about, you know, the cycles of creation and destruction.
The days and nights of Brahma.
Right. So you got these vast periods where the universe manifests, and then it goes back to this unmanifested state, pralaya, they call it.
Like this cosmic breathing in and out.
And it shows how impermanent the manifested world is compared to that eternal source.
And then we get this law of collective wholeness, which states that, quote, the assembly of individualities is a holistic system representing a being of a higher order than each individuality separately.
So it's about interconnectedness.
And synergy.
Right. The idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
And then bringing things back down to the level of the individual, the text describes those two principles within the soul.
Oh, right.
The active and the passive.
So the active principle is the divine spirit. That's where our will, our reason, our intuition comes from.
Right. And the passive principle is more like that life force, the substance we're made of.
Okay.
So it's like those two fundamental modes of operation.
Like the yin and yang of our inner being.
Exactly. And then it gets even more specific because it likens that passive force to natural inertia, quoting Kepler.
Inertia.
You know, like the tendency to stay at rest unless something acts upon you.
Right. So it's that inherent resistance to change.
And it requires that active force of the divine spirit to, like, set things in motion.
To initiate change and growth.
Okay, then the text touches on positivism. Remember, that's the idea that we can only truly know what we can observe. And it says that positivism is good for, like,